They lifted the silver lids and froze. The dish that night, some whispered, was human flesh, and the king watched to see who would swallow. Tonight, we're going to sit at a table almost no one would choose. We'll pull our chair close and listen to the soft scrape of forks, the slow hush of a court that knows it is being watched, and the still, poisonous air of a room where obedience tastes like meat. The legend you clicked on, the king who forced his court to eat human flesh, comes down to us like a cold plate. Rumors, testimonies, propaganda, and a few hard facts with too much fear in the sauce. But what actually happened? Did any ruler truly force his courtiers to consume the unthinkable? Or is this a story we invent when we want to paint our enemies as monsters? We'll explore the case most people think of first. Jean Bedel Bokassa of the Central African Empire, the soldier emperor whose refrigerators and trials spawned the darkest banquet stories of the 20th century. We'll move carefully to the Ming court of China's founding emperor, Han Wu, where some sources say a dish of pie hid a secret its diners dared not guess. We'll step into the ritual world of the Mexica, often called Aztecs, where morsels of human flesh, in a very specific sacred context, carried meanings very different from the sensational headlines you've seen. We'll pass through the shadowed halls of Ivan, the terrible Zapruchnia, where a theater of humiliation blurred into allegations of forced cannibalism. And then we'll sit back from the table, breathe, and ask, so, what is the truth? Why does the rumor of a forced cannibal banquet cling to the image of certain kings? And what does that tell us about power, about fear, and about us? The room is dim. The plates are ready. And the king is watching. Feasts can be gentle. People eat, they laugh, they pass plates, and for a moment the world feels safe. Most of us know that feeling. The hum of conversation, the warmth of a room full of food and low music. But for rulers, a table is more than a table. It is stage and sanctuary, instrument and trap. Across centuries, kings and emperors used banquets to bind allies, reward service, and stage spectacles of legitimacy. Think of elaborate coronation feasts that seem to go on forever. Think of the shimmering weights of gold plates, of roasts that tell a story of plenty and competence. Food, more than weapons, becomes the clearest language of power. When a ruler feeds you, he says, I am abundance. I'm the hand that gives. To refuse the king's food is to insult his hand. To accept it is to take part in his story. The table, then, is a tool, a theater of loyalty, one you agree to enter with your eyes open. But there's a darker edge. The moment we consider taboo, the moment a dish carries a shadow, the banquet becomes a test. Across cultures, the strongest taboos coalesce around sex and food. And the strongest of those food taboos, human flesh, sits like a warning sign at the edge of our stories. We imagine the line, then imagine the person who crosses it. What does it feel like, in a room defined by fear, to be handed a plate that is rumored to contain a fragment of a person? A king doesn't need to put a blade to your throat to make you eat. He just needs to make not eating more dangerous. This is the key to the stories you're about to hear. The supposed cannibal banquet isn't really about taste. It's about consent, or more precisely, about the absence of consent performed in front of a throne. So we begin with the 20th century's most notorious case, a man who made a nation into a stage and a court into his audience. The place is Barengo Palace, just outside Bangui. The name is Bokassa. The rumor is a dinner, and the smell of something roasts as silence gathers. Jean Bedel Bokassa was a man of uniforms, a soldier whose chest grew heavy with medals, a president who declared himself emperor, a figure who both learned and loathed the rules of display. If you want to understand the gravity of the rumor of a king feeding human flesh to his court, begin here with his story. It is a story of rank and ritual, of a coronation as lavish as any Baroque fantasy, and of a fall that left behind a trail of whispers too thick to sweep away. Picasso was born in 1921 in what would become the Central African Republic, then a French colony. His childhood held trauma. His father died violently after protesting colonial abuses. His mother is said to have taken her own life soon after. The boy who ran in those bright savannas grew into a man of the French army, fighting in Indochina and Algeria. He learned strategy, ceremony, and the polished aggression of empire. In 1966, he staged a coup, ousting his cousin, President David Dacko. The soldier was now the ruler. At first, many tried to believe in Picasso. He liked children, they said, and paraded schools like trophies. He shook hands with the city's small elite, and then with the French president. He played the paternal strongman, hosting dinners where his face softened in candlelight. But power is sticky. It clings where it touches. Over the years, the candles guttered. The dinners soured. People began to disappear. In 1976, Picasso made a choice that froze Europe's newspapers into a single startled stare. He declared the Central African Republic an empire, and himself Emperor Picasso I. The coronation in 1977 was a theater of piling excess. He wore a 20-foot velvet cape. He rode in a carriage modeled after Napoleon's. He placed the crown upon his own head. Yes, like Napoleon, and sat beneath golden eagles while the cost bled a nation. Wagons of champagne rolled, racks of food steamed. The wealth of a poor country was converted into a single feast. It is impossible to watch the footage without feeling a kind of burn in the throat. Beauty and hunger, side by side, in a room lined with mirrors. Then famine. Then rage. In January 1979, school children protested in Bangui against the price of their compulsory uniforms. The police cracked down. Bodies fell. Later that year, while Picasso visited Gaddafi in Libya, a French-backed operation, codenamed Barracuda, slipped into Bangui and replaced him with David Dacko again. Picasso's regime collapsed. Stories began to surface. Some of them were banal and ugly. Bribery, brutality, disappearances. Some are sensational. Freezers, body parts, the smell of burned meat. At his 1987 trial in Bangui, Picasso faced multiple charges: murder, embezzlement, and, most lurid, cannibalism. Witnesses testified to grim scenes. Men tortured, bodies burned, and in the story that would echo most, the roasting of human flesh at Barengo Palace. One former chef described a meat prepared and served. A policeman recalled retrieving charred remains and a mixture of spices nearby. Journalists wrote of refrigerators containing body parts, the way you and I would write a horror film's prop list. The court weighed the evidence while the world looked on. Did Picasso force his court to eat human flesh? Some sources say he hosted dinners where the main course came too late after a guest disappeared. Some sources say he summoned senior men, lifted lids with a flourish, and waited. Others insist these are stories, cruel, convenient, and unverifiable. A colonial fable reloaded for modern appetites. After all, forensics in the 1970s in Bangui had limits. Photographic chains of custody wobbled. Evidence went missing. Political motives are sometimes as strong as proof. And then there was the man himself. Picasso denied the cannibalism charges with theatrical disgust. "I am not a cannibal," he said, insisting that he ate beef, goat game, never human. He called it a French concoction, a smear meant to cloak their own manipulations. "Would I feed human flesh to my friends?" he asked. "To my ministers?" He knew how the rumor worked and tried to peel it away. The judges eventually dropped the cannibalism charge. He was convicted for murder and other crimes, but not for the consumption of human flesh. So, did the banquet happen? Here's the careful answer. Many contemporary reports describe human bodies discovered at Barengo and in and around Bokassa's residence. Several witnesses testified to the cooking of human flesh. Others, however, suggested some of those bodies were evidence of execution and torture, horrors in their own right, separate from the act of serving the meat at table. Forcing courtiers to eat human flesh sits at the edge of the archive, repeatedly alleged, intensely vivid, difficult to prove to modern standards. It remains what historians call contested. But as a story, it has already done its work. It paints a ruler as a violator of the deepest taboo. It pictures the court, a gathering of wealth and deference, as hostages at dinner. What mattered to the people in that room, if such a room fully existed the way the stories say, was not the taste. It was the choice. Eat and live. Refuse and reveal yourself. Behind the high gates of Barengo, the kitchens fall quiet. We step back from the stove, draw a breath, and travel 600 years backward to another palace where fear sat at the table and the man at the head was very sure of himself. The Ming dynasty begins with a man whose life reads like a parable written with fists. Zhu Yuanzhang, later known as the Hongwu Emperor, was born into poverty in 1328, lost his family to famine, took shelter in a Buddhist monastery, and then rose through the Red Turban rebellions to conquer an empire. He is a founder carved out of hunger and war. When he took the throne in 1368, he did so with a peasant's memory and a general suspicion. His portraits show a heavy face with a downward mouth, a ruler who, even in victory, does not relax. The Hongwu court was not a gentle place. In the 1370s and 1380s, suspicious of treason, the emperor launched purges that rippled outward from the center like shock waves. The most famous, the Hu Weiyong affair around 1380, saw the execution of tens of thousands, officials, their families, their acquaintances, the people who delivered their letters. It is difficult to hold the number in your head. It is even more difficult to hold the fear those numbers produce in a human heart. Imagine arriving at a banquet after that. Some sources say that during these purges, Hongwu hosted a dinner for senior officials. The dish was a pie. The heat came off it in a fragrant breath. The men at the table try not to look at one another. Had they not just seen colleagues vanish? Had not rumors already gone through the halls like drafts through shuttered windows? One tale, found in later unofficial histories and retellings, says Hongwu had the flesh of an executed minister baked into those pies and served to the dead man's former associates. Another version claims that after a purge, Hongwu sent each remaining minister a dish, wrapped and still warm, as a test. The point wasn't to nourish. It was to see who flinched. But did it happen? Serious historians hedge. The official Ming histories compiled later do not record a cannibal banquet. They do record flayings, mutilations, exterminations of kin, punishments that by themselves reveal a court where cruelty was policy. Scholars who study the early Ming are used to hearing extreme stories about Hongwu. He was a man who rewrote institutions, centralized power, and used relentless violence to make his vision of order real. The pie story, vivid and easy to retell, arrives to summarize this atmosphere rather than document a specific event. In some accounts, the human flesh is revealed after the fact. In others, the dish's origin is a whispered suspicion, never confirmed, hanging like smoke over a table someone else has long since cleared. Rhetorical question: what kind of ruler believes that you can prove loyalty by making men doubt what they taste? Hongwu didn't need the pie. His power had other instruments. The embroidered uniform guards, the legal codes he wrote himself, the palace's echoing chambers where he summoned officials to kneel and confess. If the pie story isn't literally true, it is figuratively accurate. It captures the feeling of a world where the ruler decides not only what you say, but what you can safely believe you just swallowed. The reality is that, under Hongwu, tens of thousands died, and officials lived under a fear so total that even a hot dish could feel like an exam. Perhaps a steward enters then and lifts the lid with fingers that tremble. Whether or not there was human flesh hidden in the crust, there was terror folded into the room. And that, to the historian, is the real main course. From the Forbidden City's halls we move further back, this time across the ocean, to a world where eating human flesh had a meaning entirely unlike European imaginations. We go to Tenochtitlan. We step carefully. When Spanish conquistadors walked into the great temple precinct of Tenochtitlan, they entered a world whose logic they didn't know how to read. They saw blood. They saw carved stones and bright paintings of gods with tongues like knives. They saw captives climbing stairs ahead of priests. They saw what they described as limbs. They saw what they called, in one breath, brutality, spectacle, and proof that they were righteous. From those first, breathless accounts, Europe's image of the Mexica, Aztecs, formed around two words: sacrifice and cannibalism. In their minds, the emperor, Moctezuma II, was a king who forced his court to dine on human flesh. That picture, in the centuries since, has stuck like a burr, but it is in important ways wrong. Here is the careful story. The Mexica religion imagined the world as a living system that required nourishment. The sun itself needed feeding, lest it weaken and the world fall. The gods, in a story told in the Florentine Codex, compiled by Bernardino de Sahagun and his Nahua collaborators, had given themselves to recreate the world after catastrophic ages. Humans, in turn, owed repayment. Sacrifice, then, was not random. It was a universe maintained by offering. Captives were taken in ritualized war. Their hearts were cut out on altars as prayers, and drums rose, and a city inhaled. The body, carefully prepared, was sometimes distributed in small portions among the warrior's family and allies. Was the emperor present? Yes. Was the court involved? Often. But forced cannibalism is the wrong phrase. These were not dinners of humiliation, but structured exchanges within a religious logic where sacrificial flesh could be cooked, often with maize, and consumed by specific people as a sacred communion. It was restricted and highly ritual. It was not, let's serve a person instead of roast at a courtly banquet, as European imaginations often picture it. Moreover, archaeological and ethno-historical work suggests that such ritual consumption was limited and symbolic, not a staple of diet. Bones found at Templo Mayor do show cut marks and evidence of post-sacrificial processing, consistent with recorded preparation. But the scale of consumption was far less than early Spanish chroniclers boasted, and their descriptions need reading with care, mixing horror, excitement, and propaganda. So why does the rumor linger that an emperor forced his court to eat human flesh? Because it serves an old rhetorical purpose. It makes the conquered people seem savage. It makes the conqueror's violence seem justified. When the Spanish wrote home about temples and ritual flesh, they did so in an idiom Europe understood: taboo. And taboo, once thrown into the story, sticks. Imagine, though, the actual scene not as a dinner at court, but as a ritual distribution. Imagine a bowl, starchy with maize, and a small piece of flesh, what some texts call tiaqualo, divine food, carried to a particular person as an honor. It might be bitter or it might be tender. It might be eaten with a prayer. It might be eaten with the composure of soldier, learned through years of training. In a world where eating this small morsel meant being part of an order that sustained a city of precise, glittering canals. It is not a scene of a king smirking while his courtiers swallow. It is a scene of communion. And yet, when Moctezuma is described in the Spanish narratives, he is often pictured in feasts of impossible rarity. Colibri, fish from far coasts, steaming trays, watched by servants who never looked at his face. It is a court like a stage. It is easy for the imagination to shift such a scene into a chamber of horrors. But the ritual consumption of flesh was not about humiliating courtiers. It was about feeding gods and making meaning in an order the Spaniards were about to destroy. From here, we cross back to another court where humiliation was very much the point. In this one, the men around the king wore black, their saddles hung with a dog's head and a broom. They called themselves the Oprichnina. Their master was Ivan IV, whom history calls terrible. Ivan IV ruled Moscow with a mix of fearful intelligence and sudden cruelty. He could be devout, reading prayers in a whisper, and then turn to an executioner with a gesture that said, "Do it now." He created in the 1560s a body called the Oprichnina, men set apart from the rest of the realm, personally loyal, black-clad, riding with symbols of their office that announced, plainly, they swept away treason and sniffed it out like dogs. The Oprichnina turned the court into a theater of fear. Afternoons could end with banquets that slid into cruelty. Foreign observers, and we must keep in mind they wrote for audiences that loved lurid tales. Record humiliations performed like plays in which Ivan forced nobles to dance, to crawl, to drink until they collapsed. And then there are the stories that veer nearer subject. Heinrich von Steden, a German adventurer whose accounts feed many histories, wrote of Oprichniki who cut up men and forced others to eat the pieces, or fed human flesh to animals in front of families to break spirits. Jerome Horsey, an English envoy, added episodes of grotesque spectacle, though his reliability is debated. We taste the sharpness of propaganda here too. Did Ivan himself force his courtiers to eat human flesh? The sources, again, are inconsistent. They agree about the brutality. Novgorod's massacre in 1570, for example, is well attested and was carried out with a cruelty that chilled even his own circle. But the specific, repeated act of enforced cannibalism at a banquet remains more rumor than documented practice. What matters, again, is the method. He turned loyalty into a performance of complicity. To eat what you despised, to toast what you feared, to smile as others wept. That was the shape of survival. If someone forced you to take a bite of the unthinkable, it would have been part of that logic. They make you abject, and you prove you will remain. Von Steden's book helped create a genre, the bad tyrant's cannibal rumor. It tells audiences what they want to believe about strong men they already fear, that there is no line they won't cross, that they have turned even dinner into a dagger. Once the story exists, it is easy to apply to others. Which brings us back to the 20th century, where rumor and propaganda learn new speeds. If we listen closely now, we can hear the scuff of a press room, the clatter of a teletype. The words cannibal and king together sell. If someone wanted to destroy your reputation in a single stroke, there are few accusations more efficient than cannibalism. It is the taboo that needs no translation. It doesn't require footnotes or nuance. If someone says you ate human flesh, most of the world doesn't pause to parse context. They recoil. Accuse a ruler not only of eating human flesh, but of forcing others to do the same. And you achieve something more precise. You show him as master of bodies and souls, able to command the most intimate act. What goes into your mouth at will is a power fantasy of absolute domination. Colonial literature is full of such accusations. There's a whole debate in anthropology about how often cannibalism actually happened versus how often it was imagined by outsiders. William Ahrens, in his provocative book, The Man-Eating Myth, did not deny that ritual cannibalism existed in some cultures, but he argued that many colonial accounts of cannibalistic feasts were inventions or exaggerations that told the colonizers more about themselves than about the people they claimed to have seen. To call your enemy a cannibal is to perform superiority. To call your enemy's king a cannibal is to perform a story about their supposed lack of civilization that nobly justifies your violence. But this doesn't mean no one ever did it. It means we must hold two truths at once. Some rulers likely used food taboos as weapons, and some stories of forced cannibalism are slanders crafted for audiences who expect to read them. Jean Bedel Bokassa sits precisely at that intersection. The French had supported him and then helped remove him. It suited some to present him not just as brutal, but as monstrous beyond the human pale. The corpse, the freezer, the pan with char marks. These are details that anchor rumor into a form of plausibility. You feel the weight of a refrigerator door. You imagine a cold. You picture steel. That is enough for some to say, I know what happened, I see it. So what do we do as historians who whisper late into the night and try to separate the sound of a fact from the sound of a story snapping into place? We read carefully. We compare sources. We look for independent corroboration. We trace the motives of those who wrote. We admit what we don't know. And we acknowledge that sometimes the softer truth matters most. Even if Bokassa never served human flesh to his courtiers, he built a palace where a rumor like that could breathe. Even if Hongwu never cut a pie with that secret filling, he built a world where officials felt the crust crack beneath their teeth and wondered, with dread, what was inside. If you had to survive such a court, would you have eaten? Or would you have lifted the fork, breathed once, and put it down? Let's return to the centerpiece. Then, this king who supposedly made dinner into a crime. One more time in a Barango palace. Listen for the lids. Watch the faces. It is late. The palace outside Bangui is warm even after the sun falls. The air smells of earth and the sweet sharpness of a marinade. In the dining hall, men talk in low voices. Some reach for their collars. The door opens and servants file in with trays, silver lids shining dully in the light. Bokassa loved ceremony. He understood how weight and repetition make people move like marionettes. He is seated. The men stand. He gestures and they sit. The meat arrives. It could be beef. It could be goat. It could be the other thing. In one version of the story, the missing guest is the answer. He isn't there. Everyone sees the empty chair. Someone in the kitchen takes a pan from the oven and sets it down. In another version, there's a laugh, a comment, a challenge. Eat, taste, tell me what you think. Somewhere a life was just ended, or somewhere, in the versions that deny it. Nothing more dramatic than a sanctimonious sizzle happened, and the power of rumor did the rest. The room cools around the plates. Each man calculates the cost of refusing. No one wants to meet eyes with anyone else. Here, a napkin shakes. There, a hand puts bread against the meat, making a small sandwich, as if that could make it easier. A mouth opens. Some chew. Some look down. It is silent as a chapel. This, the story says, is the moment when a king turns dinner into an oath. We must say it again. The legal system that judged Bokassa did not convict him of cannibalism. Journalists at the time relayed the accounts of witnesses, and those accounts differed in detail. Some described a feast. Some described only evidence after the fact. Charred remains, a lingering smell, a freezer with flesh. The body parts found could be explained by murders and tortures, which themselves are crimes of terrible magnitude. The forced court cannibal banquet, as a single, fully evidenced event, remains unproven. But it persists in memory because it fits. It fulfills a pattern in which tyrants test the bend of the people around them by making them complicit. What is most likely? That Bokassa, when enraged and drunk on his own power, used food and ceremony to humiliate and sometimes to terrify. That a toxic nexus of brutality in the palace kitchens, rumor in the streets, and political theater in the courtroom produced a story with all the hooks. Horror, taboo, the violation of trust at a table, and a king who smiles. That smile is why the story sticks. It is not just the meat, it is the watching. So if you ask what happened when a king forced his court to eat human flesh, one sober answer is, we don't know that any did, for sure, in the specific form the legend implies. Another sober answer is, in courts of fear, the ruler did not need to force. The men forced themselves because the price of refusal felt like a tomb. And if we float the camera back and look at the long arc of our species, we see the other thing too. How often we tell ourselves stories about our enemies' mouths. Food is intimate. It is one of the first ways we learn the world. Sweet, bitter, sour, salty, and the secret depths of umami. To be fed is to be cared for. To feed others is to connect. And so the abuse of feeding becomes the perfect weapon. In prisons, food becomes thin and gray, a punishment. In violent households, mealtimes become traps. In palaces, banquets become tests. The worst tests are the ones that ask you to swallow shame. If you live in a world where the king can turn your face to the plate and make you eat something that unravels your sense of self, then you live in a world where loyalty becomes indistinguishable from self-betrayal. Dictators know this instinctively. Not all of them turn to the cannibal rumor. Some choose other taboos. Some force their ministers to sign confessions, to praise them on camera, to dance at humiliating parties, to pretend to enjoy what they hate. These are all, in their way, the same act as the spoon lifted and placed between reluctant lips. You don't raise an army to make men complicit. You raise a fork. So when you encounter a story about a king who forced his court to eat human flesh, ask two questions. First, is there evidence beyond rumor? Who wrote this and why? Second, what had to be true about the court for the story to feel plausible? Often the answers don't satisfy, but together they tell us about fear's temperature in those rooms. Bokassa's court was an ecosystem of fear and favor. Hongwu's was a maze of rules policed by death. Moctezuma's was a ritual city mapped by gods and draped in obligations outsiders did not understand. Ivan's was a theater where black-clad men rehearsed cruelty every day. In all of them, food was the language of power, and sometimes its grammar cracked under the weight of rumor and blood. If you're feeling the air go stale, it's because we've been in those rooms a long time. Let's step toward the door and back to the quiet. One more mouthful of analysis, and we're done. We come, finally, to the question you sat down with. Did a king force his court to eat human flesh? There are three answers, layered like horses. The negative answer. There is no single, indisputable case in the modern evidence record of a royal court being forced, in a formal banquet, to consume human flesh with documentable participants and forensic proof. The Bokassa case came closest to establishing such a narrative, but the legal verdict did not convict on cannibalism. Hongwu's pie appears in later, less reliable sources, and likely functions as allegory for an atmosphere of fear rather than fact. Ivan's court produced humiliations and massacres, and there are accounts of forced cannibalism by his opportunity, but not a clean case of a formal royal court banquet of enforced cannibalism. In the Mexico world, ritual consumption of human flesh did occur, but it was religious and structured. The phrase forced his court to eat human flesh is a distortion. The symbolic answer. Courts sometimes created situations functionally equivalent to forced cannibalism. The demand that one perform an act of disgust or betrayal to prove obedience. Whether the dish contained human flesh is less important than the fact that everyone thought it might, and that no one dared ask. In this sense, the story is true even when it is false. It teaches us how tyrannies work, not with constant gunfire, but with a quiet plate and a watching face. The cautionary answer. We must be precise with such tales, because they bleed easily into the colonial and propagandistic impulse to dehumanize the other. Labeling a ruler a cannibal fits a genre that evicts them from humanity and excuses violence against them. Truth, especially about such intimate horrors, deserves our patience. Where does that leave us? If you need a villain, you have plenty. If you need a precise, documented menu, you have less than you'd think. If you need a lesson, it's this: watch who serves you and watch what they want the bite to prove. In our own lives, smaller, less lurid versions of this test stand in front of us all the time. What are you willing to swallow to be safe? What taste stays in your mouth after? The lids are back on. The hall is empty. The food is cold. We leave. We begin with a whispered rumor under the weight of a silver lid. An emperor, a court, a bite no one wanted to take. We followed it across centuries and continents, held it up to the light, and found the story both thinner and thicker than it first appeared. Thinner, because hard evidence for a king who forced his court to eat human flesh is rare and unreliable. Thicker, because the rumor grows out of real structures of fear, ritual, and propaganda. Bokassa's palace, Hongwu's purges, Ivan's theater, Moctezuma's sacred meals. Each teaches us a different part of the lesson. Food is power. Taboo is a tool. Rumor is a weapon. And at a certain level of pressure, people will do what they must to survive. If this quiet journey through the darkest dining rooms in history made you think, I'd love to have you at the table again. Subscribe for more whispered histories. Share this with someone who likes the shadows. And next time you sit down to eat, notice who's watching and what the meal is trying to say.